Okay, so forget canals, forget dams. Egypt is considering something much stronger. They want to let the Mediterranean Sea fall into the Sahara Desert, not metaphorically, literally. There's a place in western Egypt where the land drops more than 400 feet below sea level, a basin so dry it almost never rains, where temperatures hit 120 degrees and nothing lives for long. For most of human history, it's been useless. But to an engineer, it looks less like desert and more like an empty container. If you connect it to the ocean, gravity does the work. Water pours into its own, and once it starts, it doesn't stop. The desert heat evaporates the water, which pulls more seawater in, which spins turbines, which creates electricity, which could power desalination plants, which could create drinking water, which could reduce Egypt's dependence on the Nile. In other words, one hole on the ground could become a power plant, a battery, and a freshwater factory all at once. This idea was so tempting that engineers once seriously considered proposed carving the channel using over 200 nuclear explosions. They didn't do it, but the plan never died. Now, with modern tunneling technology and a growing water crisis upstream, Egypt is once again looking west, not at the river that built the civilization, but at the desert that might replace it. But how close is this to reality? And what happens if you actually put a sea in the Sahara? When Europeans first began mapping the Qatar Depression in detail, they didn't see it as useless desert. They saw a vacant basin. To an engineer, that's not nothing. That's potential energy. A place where water could drop. A place where gravity could be harassed. A place where the desert could be filled the way a bathtub is filled, if you could just reach the faucet. And that's where the idea was born. Flood the depression, create an inland sea. In the 19th century, engineers were equal parts scientists and visionary, basically dreaming with calculators and mustaches. People genuinely believed that if you flooded a chunk of the Sahara, it could reshape the climate. More humidity, more clouds, more rain, and more fertile land. The logic at the time sounded almost magical. Water in the desert could soften the heat, change wind patterns, and eventually allow farming where nothing grew. To Europeans in that area, that kind of project felt like rewriting the laws of nature. But then the reality hit hard. To flood it, you need a canal or channel from the Mediterranean, and building that across miles of desert would cost a fortune, an astronomical fortune. Even colonial powers with deep pockets didn't want to gamble that much money on an experiment that might fail, collapse, or become a maintenance nightmare in shifting sand. So, the Sahara Sea dream went dormant. After World War II, the world's mindset changed. Humanity had just built machines and weapons so powerful that they felt supernatural. People started believing technology could literally do anything if you had enough will and funding. That's when Egypt and foreign engineers revisited the Qatar project in the 50s and 60s, right? And it's just so easy to see why. The geometry is perfect. The Mediterranean is right there. The depression is far below sea level. A pathway would mean water flows in naturally. No pumps, no constant energy input. Gravity does the work. But the project had a problem that was not on the blueprints. The desert route was littered with death. The region near El Alamein, one of the most famous World War II battlefields, still contains vast amounts of unexploded mines and shells buried under the sand. Hundreds of thousands, potentially more than that. Even surveying the land was dangerous. Cutting a canal through it? That's not construction. That's suicide with paperwork. Then stock on the natural conditions. 120-degree Fahrenheit heat, constant wind, loose shifting soils, sandstorms that erase work like it never happened. The plan kept collapsing under the same truth. Yeah, it's physically possible, but Doing it safely and affordably is another story. In the mid-1970s, when engineers looked at the problem and said, if digging is impossible, why are we still talking about digging? And then they proposed something that sounded like the plot of a rejected disaster movie. Not one, not a handful. The proposal called for around 213 nuclear devices, each with a yield near 1.5 megatons. To put that in perspective, that's massively more powerful than Hiroshima. On the order of magnitude where you stop talking about a bomb and start talking about a geological event. The argument was simple and terrifying. A series of underground nuclear detonations that would blast a trench in a fraction of the time and cost of a conventional excavation. On paper, it looked efficient. The trench appears, water flows, the depression fills, and new coastal cities rise along the desert shoreline. But experts immediately pointed out the obvious. You don't efficiently detonate nuclear weapons near a sea connected to multiple countries and expect it to go just fine. Radioactive dust would politely stay inside Egypt's borders. The fallout would drift into Libya, Israel, and across the Mediterranean into southern Europe. And even if you ignored radiation, you still have major uncertainties. Would the trench collapse? Would it fill with sand? Would the shock destabilize surrounding geology? Would it fracture in ways that made it unusable? So the nuclear version died for the same reason most nuclear mega solutions die. It solves one problem by creating 5 catastrophic ones. But again, the dream didn't die. It just waited for technology to catch up. Here's what changed in the modern era. Engineers stopped trying to build the connection on the surface. Instead, they asked, what if we go under the desert? That's where the modern proposal gets real. Because today, machines that bore tunnels are not science experiments. They are industrial monsters, capable of chewing through rock, salt, chalk, and sediment, and then lining the tunnel behind them with concrete rings as they go by. And Egypt is not new to this. The country has built major tunnel infrastructure using TBMs, underground metro construction in Cairo through challenging soils, tunnels under and around the Suez Canal, large-scale civil engineering in environments that are not gentle. So the tunnel idea isn't fantasy, it's an engineering project. Expensive, yes, but no longer impossible. The distance required is roughly 34 to 50 miles depending on route choice. One end connects to the Mediterranean, the other opens into the dry floor of the depression. And because the depression sits 426 feet below sea level, water naturally flows down with gravity. No pumps needed to fill it. Open the gate, and the sea begins to pour into the Sahara. If you just let the Mediterranean flow in unchecked, you risk a system that gets out of control, not because the depression would overflow, but because planners want stable levels for energy and safety. So the plan includes controlling the final water height. Instead of filling all the way to sea level, it would likely stabilize around 197 feet below sea level, creating a vast inland sea that remains lower than the Mediterranean. That makes it a controlled system. It also preserves the drop, right? Because the vertical difference that makes the power generation possible. It also preserves the drop, the vertical difference that makes the power generation possible. And if this works, Egypt gets something no one expects to see on a world map. A sea the size of a Great Lake in the middle of the Sahara. Here's the real genius of Qatar. This is basically hydroelectric power without a river. The Mediterranean becomes the source reservoir. The Qatar basin becomes the sink reservoir. The tunnel becomes the spillway. As water drops into the depression, it runs through turbines, spinning generators. The vertical drop is around 426 feet. That is an enormous head height, a level of potential energy that makes engineers start smiling in a way normal people should probably be worried about. And unlike a river, you can regulate inflow with gates and tunnel design. But the bigger advantage is what happens after the water enters the depression. It evaporates, like a lot. This is a desert furnace. The water would bleed into the sky continuously, and that evaporation becomes the engine that keeps the system running. As water evaporates, the basin's level drops slowly. As it drops, it pulls in more Mediterranean water. As more water flows in, it spins turbines again. It becomes a loop. Inflow to energy, into evaporation, into more inflow, into more energy. Rinse and repeat. Experts describe it as a gravity-fed system with continuous replenishment. Normal language, it's a natural turbine that never really stops. The hotter it gets, the more evaporation happens. The more evaporation happens, the stronger the pull for inflow. And the more inflow, the more power. It's basically a power plant that gets better in heat waves, which is convenient because Egypt is basically heat wave headquarters. Estimates often land in the range of 600 to 2,200 megawatts, producing 4 to 7 billion kilowatt hours annually. That's enough to meaningfully supply multiple large urban regions. Egypt isn't just thinking, making electricity. They're thinking, make electricity and store it. The proposal includes building a secondary reservoir at a higher elevation. During the day, when solar generation is high, excess electricity would pump water into that high reservoir. At night, when demand rises and solar output drops, the water is released back down through turbines to generate power again. That is pumped storage, one of the most proven large-scale energy storage methods on Earth. And with drops in the hundreds of feet and huge volumes of water, the storage capacity could reach into the millions of kilowatt hours. So now Qatar isn't just a generator, it is a stabilizer for the grid. In Ethiopia, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is one of the largest hydroelectric projects on Earth and absolutely central to Egypt's anxiety. The Blue Nile contributes a massive portion of Nile flow into Egypt. Ethiopia's dam represents development and electricity for them. But for Egypt, it represents a terrifying new variable: upstream control. The dam's reservoir holds an enormous volume of water. While it fills, downstream flow can decrease, even if temporarily, and in Egypt, that can translate into reduced irrigation, crop losses, freshwater surges, political instability. The real fight has always been over timing and control. How fast the reservoir fills, what guarantees exist during the drought years, how downstream countries are protected. Negotiations have dragged on for years with outside mediation attempts, but the underlying problem doesn't go away. The Nile doesn't have extra water. If more is held upstream, less arrives downstream. That's physics, folks, not politics. And Egypt can't replace the Nile, but it can reduce vulnerability. That's why Qatar keeps resurfacing in modern discussion, because in Qatar, if it can produce significant electricity, that electricity can produce desalinated water. And desalination means Egypt can expand its freshwater supply without depending solely on the Nile. It doesn't solve the Nile conflict, but it gives Egypt leverage. It gives options. And options are everything when your entire civilization depends on one river. So when you hear the phrase, Egypt wants to bring the Mediterranean into the Sahara, it sounds like clickbait, right? But the deeper story is a national strategy. Use gravity to create consistent energy, use energy to create fresh water, use water to expand agriculture and settlement, use new regions to reduce crowding along the Nile, use desalination to reduce dependence on upstream politics. It's a loop. Energy supports water. Water supports life. Life supports stability. And when you zoom out, you realize why this plan, in some form, has haunted engineers for over a century. Because Qatar is one of those places where geography offers a cheat code: a huge basin below sea level, a sea like next door. Like, that combination is like a natural machine just waiting for the right era of engineering to activate it. And Egypt may be closer than ever to flipping the switch.